Late at night, in the middle of the week, we had this totally random idea. With everything happening in the world, we craved a break in nature. It was spontaneous. One moment we were playing PlayStation, and the next we were hit with the excitement to escape. Within an hour, we grabbed our stuff, jumped into our cars, and drove out of the city. We headed to a small town outside the urban area and left our vehicles behind since the place we wanted to camp wasn't accessible by road. It was such a cool vibe, just a bunch of city guys carrying backpacks, tents, knives, and snacks. The mood was lighthearted, and no one was nervous or overthinking. Even as we trekked through dense woods in the middle of the night, far from civilization, with only our phone flashlights to guide us. After a few hours of walking, we stumbled upon what seemed like the perfect spot, a lovely little lake with a wide open area around it. We set up our tents and made ourselves comfortable. It's worth mentioning that all four of us had served in the military and had survival training. So, we were pretty laid back, not worried about anything going wrong. None of us brought firearms since they require permits back home, and we figured we'd be fine without them. Once we found our spot, one of my friends and I decided to scout the area while the other two stayed behind, gathering firewood. When we regrouped, we were just hanging out around the campfire, chatting, joking, and reflecting on how unlucky our generation had been with everything going on. Time flew by, and around 5 a.m., we agreed to get some sleep. We planned to wake up at 11 a.m. or so to make the most of the daylight. Barely 5 minutes after settling into our tents, we heard a cat meowing, a distressed, almost desperate sound. My wife and I have 2 cats at home, and I grew up surrounded by them, so I immediately recognized that cry. We all exchanged puzzled glances. How could a cat survive out here, in the middle of nowhere? Maybe it was feral, but we decided to investigate. We stepped out of our tents and spotted a black cat. None of us were particularly religious or superstitious, but we couldn't help feeling slightly uneasy. I had some sausages in my bag, so I pulled one out and tossed it toward the cat. As I tried to get closer, it suddenly vanished into the darkness. I brushed it off. It's the woods, after all. I returned to the tent, trying to fall asleep again. 15 minutes later, one of my friends whispered that he heard something moving outside the tent. At first, we thought it might be a pack of wild dogs, or maybe the cat had returned. We cautiously unzipped the tent a little to take a look. What we saw froze us. A massive black boar. If you're unfamiliar with wild boars, let me tell you, they're no joke. These animals are incredibly strong, with tough hides that can even withstand a bullet. And, of course, we didn't have any firearms. My friends and I whispered anxiously, wondering what to do if it decided to charge at us. Then we heard that same cat meowing again. It didn't make sense. Both the cat and the boar were moving around our camp, just a meter or so away. It was bizarre that the 2 animals seemed aware of each other but weren't attacking. The cat even seemed comfortable around the boar, which only made the situation feel more unsettling. They lingered for what felt like an eternity, probably about an hour, circling our camp. None of us dared move or make a sound. As dawn broke, both the boar and the cat quietly left, disappearing into the forest. We didn't waste any time packing up and leaving the campsite ourselves. To this day, I can't explain what we experienced. If anyone has a logical explanation for such strange behavior, I'd love to hear it. Thanks for sticking around for this story. It still gives me chills. In Arizona, we had one of those RVs with bunk beds, a little kitchen, and a tiny bathroom. One afternoon, my buddy and I were wandering around when a guy approached us and started talking. He looked to be in his late 20s and asked if my friend and I wanted to hang out and maybe go for a swim. There was something about him that felt off, so we declined and went back to our parents. We didn't give it much thought after that. Later that night, I woke up unexpectedly. My bed was near a window, and when I turned over, I saw him peering at me through the glass. I screamed, waking everyone up. My dad was annoyed at being disturbed, but eventually got up to check outside. He didn't see anyone and told us to settle down and get some sleep. The next morning, my dad looked around for the guy, but he was already gone. He'd packed up and left before dawn. A few years ago, 3 of my friends and I decided to go on a camping trip in the When we arrived at the campsite, the ranger in charge made it very clear that there was a major bear issue in the area. We were warned that even leaving out drinks could lead to a fine, and all food had to be stored either in a bear-proof container or locked inside a car. On the first day, we were extremely cautious. But on the second day, someone in our group, a careless guy, dropped an uncooked sausage at my spot. Instead of grilling it or sealing it in a bag to store properly, he decided to toss it into the bushes right behind my tent. Fast forward a few hours. We had been drinking, and I'd eventually fallen asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of something running around the area near our tent. My friend and I shared the tent, and I initially thought it was just the other group members playing a prank on us. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but the sounds continued throughout the night. Something kept wandering near our campsite, sniffing around the tents. The moment that truly terrified us was when it came up to the tent and started sniffing near our feet. Both of us were absolutely terrified, crying and yelling. We grabbed the air mattress pump and turned it on, trying to make noise to scare it away. I was certain we were about to be attacked by a bear. Luckily, we weren't. And before you ask, I have no idea how we managed to fall asleep again after that. By the way, keeping weed in a tent is another thing that can attract bears. When I was around 12, my parents took my best friend and me on a camping trip in the woods. When I was a kid, about 6 years old, I went to the creek with my dad to brush my teeth. Our dog was acting strangely. He was jumpy and kept nervously staring at the ground. We didn't realize what he was trying to warn us about until we were walking back. A long, bluish-gray snake suddenly sprang out, slithering right between my legs. My dad grabbed me and carried me back to our campsite as quickly as he could. Another time, when I was around 9, I was camping with a friend and both our families. My friend and I decided to explore some huge boulders near the site. After wandering away from our chatting parents for a while, they were okay with it as long as we stuck together. We faintly heard the sound of rushing water. Excited, we ran down a rocky slope, hoping to reach the river and maybe splash around. But just as we got closer, a deep, guttural growl stopped us in our tracks. The sound came from the direction of the water, and it made my stomach drop. My friend looked just as uneasy. Without saying a word, we turned around and bolted back to the campsite. Later, we learned that a bear had been prowling the area. It had raided a nearby camper's food supply and even torn through their tents. The bear tracks led straight to the part of the riverbank where we had heard that growl. If we had let our curiosity get the better of us, we might not have made it back safely to tell the story. More recently, last summer, I camped in a very remote area, and when we arrived at the site, admit it, Virginia has some of the best mountain trails, and that's why I often drive out there to hike and camp. One time, I decided to take on a trail that turned out to be tougher than I had anticipated. It wasn't the steepness that got me. I've hiked steep trails out west, but the constant ups and downs made it feel endless. As evening approached, it started to get darker, and I realized I needed to set up camp while there was still enough light. I stopped about half a mile from the peak, thinking I'd finish the hike the next morning. The night began uneventfully. I pitched my tent at a great spot, had some dinner, and settled in for the night. It was only then that I realized something unusual. I hadn't crossed paths with a single other person during the entire hike. first, it didn't seem odd, but soon enough it would. I've always had trouble falling asleep and usually stay awake for at least an hour. While lying there, I thought I heard faint footsteps moving around nearby. The pace of the steps made me dismiss it as my imagination running wild, but just to be safe, I reached into my bag, pulled out my large knife, and kept it beside me in the sleeping bag. The next morning, I woke up and ate some oatmeal for breakfast. As I was packing up, I noticed something strange near my tent. A bundle of dried sticks and small berries tied together with a thin, green string. My heart sank. Internally, I was freaking out, but I kept my composure, quickly packed my gear, and left the site within minutes. I decided to forego the summit and headed straight back down the trail. On the way down, a thick fog rolled in, and I somehow wandered onto a side trail. After a while, I realized I was lost. Thankfully, I had a compass with me and used it to reorient myself, eventually finding the main path again. The relief I felt was immense, and I made it back to my car without any further issues. Later, I found out that the same morning, a 25-year-old hiker died on the very same trail. If I hadn't gotten lost and rejoined the main path later than planned, I might have encountered him. The circumstances of his death were unsettling. From what I gathered, he supposedly fell while trying to climb out of a ravine, but his backpack was found far from where he fell. He had called 911 but never managed to speak to anyone. The whole thing still creeps me out. It's hard not to think about the bundle I found and what might have been if my timing had been different. We were camping with a van and had a large beta tent. It was a fairly spacious campsite with a few wide trails cutting through, leading to the nearby road. What stood out was that there were no other campers in any of the sites within several miles of us. We picked a small nook nestled in the bushes on one side, while the camper van was parked on the other. This setup meant that anyone walking those trails would pass directly between us. During the day, we spent time riding dirt bikes and eventually returned to our separate sleeping areas. As usual, I struggled to fall asleep. Around 2 a.m., according to my phone, I glanced out through the thin, semi-transparent mesh of the tent. On the trail outside, I spotted what looked like a single stick or branch lying across the path, illuminated by a faint light. I stared at it for a long while, trying to figure out what it was, as the light remained completely still. Then came the next thing I remember clearly: the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. The crunch of gravel echoed around the perimeter of the tent as someone, or something, walked in a steady, repetitive loop. At first, I assumed it was just an animal curious about our camp, maybe annoyed that we had taken over its usual space. But the footsteps persisted, becoming increasingly unsettling. That branch I'd been staring at was still visible through the mesh, lit up faintly. I started to feel drowsy but was abruptly jarred awake when I realized the footsteps had stopped, and the branch was no longer visible. What came next made my blood run cold. Just a few feet beyond the tent's mesh window, I could barely make out the shape of a crouching, motionless figure. Its silhouette reminded me of something unsettling, like a creature from a horror game. The figure seemed nude, with something resembling twigs or branches encircling its head. I couldn't tell which direction it was facing, and my poor night vision only added to the eerie scene. At some point, the figure simply vanished. When I looked back, the branch on the trail was visible again, though it had started to resemble a crucifix to me. A detail I'm sure was just my mind playing tricks. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, everything seemed perfectly normal. My first instinct was to check around the tent for signs of footsteps, but the ground was just gravel and compacted dirt, leaving no clear tracks. Over breakfast, we talked about what everyone else had experienced. It turned out that later in the night, around 2:30 a.m., after I'd finally fallen asleep, someone had seen a lone person walking through our campsite with a flashlight. None of us had left our tents, and whoever it was would have needed to hike for miles to reach us. We decided it must have been someone taking an unusual nighttime stroll. But even now, the thought makes my skin crawl. I've spent most of my life hiking and camping around North Carolina and love being out in nature, but I can't shake the eerie feeling from that night. I wandered through the nearby forest and eventually set up a campfire. After spending a few hours by the fire scrolling through my phone, I started to get an odd, unsettling sensation. I couldn't quite pinpoint what it was, so I dismissed it as paranoia and decided it was time to call it a night. I have a habit of tying the zippers on my tent, just as a precaution in case anything or anyone stumbles upon my campsite and tries to get in. After drifting off to sleep, I was abruptly awakened by the sound of someone tampering with the zipper of my tent. Of course, they wouldn't know the zippers were tied shut. I always carry a handgun with me wherever I go, so I quietly reached for it, lying still and straining my ears to catch any sound. I heard faint footsteps moving around the camp, and then I noticed a shadow pass by the faintly glowing embers of the fire. For a while, everything went quiet. Moving as slowly as I could, I unzipped the tent just a sliver, barely enough to peek outside. What I saw made every hair on my body stand on end. Standing at the edge of the campsite, faintly illuminated by the dying fire, were two figures. In the dim light, I couldn't tell where they were looking or what they were doing, so I stayed silent and watched. Suddenly, one of them lunged at me, and I felt a knife stab into my upper body twice. For context, I'm a former grappling champion, so adrenaline took over. In less than a second, I had the attacker pinned beneath me and was punching him relentlessly until he stopped moving. I stood up, debating whether to shoot him, but I couldn't bring myself to shoot someone who was unconscious. Instead, I ran toward my car in a panic, grabbing a flashlight along the way. Terrified and unsure if more people were nearby, I fumbled with the flashlight and scanned the area. I couldn't see anyone. My heart raced as I realized the man I had fought seemed to be gone. Bewildered, I half-stepped out of my car, unable to process what was happening. I was certain I had incapacitated one man and beaten another unconscious. I returned to my car, grabbed a towel, and wrapped it tightly around my shoulder to slow the bleeding. After managing the pain for a moment, I decided to check the campsite again. Every step I took was filled with dread, expecting another attack. When I reached the spots where I had fought the two men, there was nothing. No bodies, no blood, no footprints, absolutely nothing. Panic set in. My mind raced, trying to comprehend how they could have disappeared. To confirm my sanity, I fired my pistol into the woods a few times, then ran back to my car. I drove away as fast as I could, leaving my camping gear behind. Even as I sped through the dark forest, a chilling realization hit me. This wasn't a dream. My injuries and the scars on my hands from punching the attacker were real. About a mile away, with my car windows slightly open, I heard loud, eerie laughter, multiple voices. It didn't make sense. I was far from the campsite, yet the sound seemed unnaturally loud, echoing through the trees. That terrifying laughter made me floor the gas pedal. To this day, I have no idea what I encountered that night. It wasn't a ghost, it couldn't have been, given the injuries I sustained. But if they were human, how did they vanish so completely? One detail that still haunts me is the memory of their faces, or lack thereof. I couldn't see any features, only darkness. The scars remain as a permanent reminder that what happened wasn't just in my imagination. It all occurred, and I think it's best not to talk about it. He looked terrified, like he'd never encountered anything like it before. To this day, I still don't know what or who it was. Later in life, I asked my aunt, who lived nearby and had grown up in the area, if she had experienced anything similar. She avoided the question, only saying that we shouldn't have been camping there and that my dad was reckless for letting us go. Since then, I've left my small town, moved to another state, and heard similar stories in the southeastern region, with the same unwillingness to explain what might have happened. If anyone has insights, I'm all ears. As a kid, I grew up in the western suburbs of Melbourne, Australia, in a neighborhood called Meadowview. Sounds pleasant, right? Well, there were no meadows and much of the area was government housing, known for being rough. Despite that, my childhood was happy, and my friends and I made the most of what we had. We spent our days exploring the local bushland, riding bikes, building swings, catching frogs, and wandering. I knew the area as well as my own backyard. Nothing about it seemed particularly eerie, except for an old nursing home perched on a hill at the bushland's edge. It was called Hillside Care Facility, and security patrolled the area. Sometimes they'd chase us out. Behind the nursing home was an odd structure, like the foundation of an unfinished building. It had concrete walls and half-dirt, half-brick rooms. It looked like people occasionally used it as a hangout or makeshift shelter. There were old food cans, discarded clothes, and broken items. By 2004, I was 15 years old. My friends and I had just started experimenting with weed and thought it'd be fun to camp in the bush. We bought a cheap tent from a discount store and decided to set up camp in a valley on the western side, far enough from the nursing home's patrol routes. Around 4 p.m., we hiked to our spot and pitched the tent before sunset. I'd managed to get a small amount of weed, and the three of us were eager to try it. None of us told our parents, knowing they wouldn't approve. As night fell, we lit a small fire and each took a turn smoking. My friends were deep in conversation, laughing and having fun, while I started feeling uneasy. Suddenly seemed like we weren't alone. My senses heightened, and I thought I heard faint rustling in the distance. I waved my hands to hush my friends, whispering, "Did you hear that?" Before I could finish, a strange voice echoed from the darkness. "I know where you are." It was raspy and menacing, like someone unhinged. We froze, staring at one another in disbelief. After a few seconds, instincts took over, and we bolted toward the nursing home, hoping to escape the bushland. As we ran, I glanced back and saw a tall, shadowy figure on top of the abandoned structure. It looked like someone in a cloak, looming ominously. I didn't stop to investigate. When we finally made it out of the bush, we looked back in relief, only to see a pale, ghostly figure moving toward us from the hill. We ran straight to my house, too shaken to return to the bush that night. The next day, we went back to clean up our campsite. Despite the unsettling night, we kept exploring the bush during the day. One afternoon, while playing near a tree swing not far from where we'd camped, we heard the blood-curdling screams of a girl. She cried out, "Help me," followed by the sound of a chainsaw. We froze, staring toward the thick shrubs where the noise came from. There were no paths or clearings in that part of the bush. Panic set in, and we ran back to my house, telling my dad what we'd heard. He grabbed our dog and joined us in searching the area. Strangely, when we got to my house, an old man was circling it on a bicycle with a bucket on his head. I'd seen him around town before, but his strange behavior unnerved me. When we returned to the bush with my dad and the dog, we found nothing. These experiences left me questioning everything. Were we imagining things? Was the man on the bike somehow connected? Who yelled at us? And was there really a chainsaw-wielding maniac? Could the nursing home harbor dark secrets or unexplained entities that haunted the area? To this day, I don't have answers. If anyone familiar with Meadowview Bushland has experienced something similar, I'd love to hear about it. Growing up, we kids naturally played together and sometimes grouped up to explore the area. In the mid to late 90s, in a quiet part of rural Indiana, there wasn't much for entertainment. The village was quite old, with the earliest records showing it was established in the 1780s as a trading post. Indiana didn't even become a state until 1816. Our village had a small church in the center, an old schoolhouse that had been turned into a residence nearby, and a field with thick woods surrounding most of the town. My dad had grown up in the area and was full of stories about the history and local legends. One story he often told was about a small fort nearby. It had started as a French post, later taken over by the British, and eventually became American. No one knew exactly where it had been located, but there were mentions of it in historical records. According to legend, it was an important stop for trade between settlers and local Native American tribes. Over time, as more settlers arrived, tensions rose, leading to violent conflicts. The fort was supposedly destroyed by a fire, with many lives lost. My dad always said the land felt wrong, as if it carried the weight of the tragedies that had occurred. When we played in the woods, the adults in the village gave us strict warnings. If the woods went silent, we were to leave immediately. If we heard our name called while deep in the trees, we were never to respond. Just turn around and go home as fast as possible. Everyone in the village understood that strange things happened in the area. Most days were uneventful, but sometimes the woods felt like something out of a dream or a nightmare. One of the most well-known legends involved the people of the woods. They weren't necessarily feared, but were respected and avoided. There were other things out there too, but those were best left alone. Now for my experience. When I was 11, I decided I wanted to go camping. It was mid-August, with muggy days but pleasantly cool nights. I convinced 2 of my friends to join me. While most people didn't camp in our woods, my dad said we could go as long as he came along to keep an eye on us. I reluctantly agreed. The day before, I went out to find a good camping spot. I knew of a flat area near a creek that seemed perfect. As I always did before entering the woods, I left an offering, a little food or a trinket. The hike was uneventful, and I spent time clearing the site of sticks and stones, building a fire pit, and gathering wood for the night. It was then I noticed how quiet everything had become. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of the breeze. It was unnerving. I froze, straining to hear anything. After what felt like minutes, I finally heard a crow caw in the distance, and the usual sounds of the forest returned. Relieved, I chalked it up to me making too much noise and scaring everything off. That evening, around 6 p.m., my friends arrived with their gear. After dinner, we all headed to the campsite. My dad and I carried most of the supplies. The walk was uneventful, and after setting up our tents and lighting the fire, we roasted marshmallows and told stories. By 11 p.m., we were ready to sleep. As we crawled into our tents, the wind started to pick up. My dad mentioned rain might be coming, but something in his tone sounded off. He loved the rain, yet he didn't look excited about it. The wind eventually died down, and everything went eerily quiet again. No crickets, no creek sounds, nothing. I heard one of my friends unzip his tent, so I unzipped mine too. My dad was already outside, gripping a machete and staring into the woods. My friend whispered, asking if I had heard a noise. I hadn't, but my heart was pounding too loudly to be sure. Then we heard it, a faint, distant voice calling, "Hello!" It sounded wrong, like someone trying to mimic a woman's voice but not quite getting it right. My dad signaled for me to throw more wood on the fire. The growing flames pushed back the darkness, but the voice came again, closer this time. "Hello!" it called. We all froze. My dad stood near the fire, his eyes locked on the treeline. My other friend peeked out of his tent, and the 4 of us listened, waiting. Nothing happened for what felt like an eternity. Then, faint rustling came from deeper in the woods. My dad stayed on high alert, but the voice didn't return. Hours passed. The forest came alive again as dawn approached. Birds chirping, crickets singing, and the creek bubbling. We packed up and hiked home, stopping often to look and listen. None of us spoke until we reached my backyard. Finally, my dad broke the silence, telling us never to talk about what had happened.